Okay, so welcome to our first Better Value, Sooner Safer, Happier EMEA meetup after the summer, starting a new year, a new term time for us, and thank you all for joining us. Today we have Simon Noone. Simon's someone I've known for probably around two or so years. We first met on the Enterprise Agile Leadership Network, where I heard him talk. And that was absolutely super. So we're really pleased and super stoked that he's agreed to come and share some of his insight now with our community. So without further ado, over to you, Simon. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks for that, Matt. And it's lovely to see some familiar faces. And there's a bunch of people here that I've not met before. So hello, I'm Simon Noone. I've worked with project and product delivery organisations and teams for I think it's probably about 17 years now. So I've been around a little bit, seen some good stuff, seen some not so good stuff, some stuff in between. And, I love to tap into the community, like Sooner Safer Happier, to learn new things. And I've learned a lot from Sooner Safer Happier. So this is my bit and to, throw a little bit back out there for the community as well, to share some of my experiences. I was working permanently for quite a while, but recently I've stepped into the world of more consultancy. And really, I've got a goal to help accelerate outcomes for people, teams, and organizations. And that's my passion outside of family life. So this is hopefully going to be useful in terms of maybe giving you some ideas for how you can accelerate outcomes in your situations. There's a couple of things I'm going to talk about tonight, and it's all related back to improving outcomes. But what I'm going to talk to you about is it's an example of something. It's not a blueprint, and I've got a couple of key objectives that I'd like to cover. So number one is you, the audience, take away one or two ideas that will help enable better outcomes. That would be a great outcome from my perspective. And then the second piece was to provide you with some practical tips on tools and techniques, some things that you might be familiar with, but maybe slightly different framing of those things, all about aiding continuous improvement. I'd request, if possible, to hold questions until the end. Feel free to pop them in the chat if you'd like to, but I won't take questions as we're going through, just because I'll keep the flow of the information going. But rest assured, there'll be plenty of time at the end to dive into some of those questions. Also, because sometimes people say, oh, but I'll forget the question I had if you just carry on jabbering on. What I've done is I've set up a Slido for us to capture some questions as well. So you can join that Slido either by going to slido.com and typing in that number, 1209779, or if you want to do it on your mobile phone, feel free to just do a capture of the QR code. And to check that we're working okay, if you could head over now, I'm going to activate a poll and I'm going to check, where are people from? So kind of what Matt was going to do before, but I've stolen that one. Where are you located? We're remote. I always find it really interesting. How diverse in location are we? And I'll start us off. I'm in Ruddington, which is in Nottingham. So pretty much in the centre of the country. Oh, wow. Quite a broad set of locations. This is great. We have a far-reaching community here, which is awesome stuff. Slido works. This is a good little test as well. So thank you for throwing those in there. Okay. So what's the story? So I want to set the scene a little bit here. And the story of what I want to talk to you tonight is about how a large financial services organisation, and when I say large, I'm talking about 70-ish product teams and about 500-ish stakeholders that are, part of this. And I want to talk to you about how they change the way that they think about the effectiveness of how they deliver value, but doing so in a balanced and sustainable way. I want to talk a little bit about how teams became empowered to challenge the status quo, and how measuring what matters enables improved transparency, inspection, and adaptation. It's not a Scrum story, by the way. They are the pillars of Scrum, people probably notice, but they're useful in the framing of what we'll talk about in terms of continuous improvement. We'll also cover the mindset shift that emerged and associated enablers, some things that helped, and some things maybe to avoid based on my experience in this example. And I'll try and tie in some of the insights. So I've been back to speak to folks, some of the insights from the folks that are leading the change now. I'm going to go on a bit of a journey with some significant changes that took place before team effectiveness was introduced. And I'll talk about that wider journey because it's really useful in the context. I'll do that in a few moments. You'll see a disclaimer on here. I'm really keen to shout this one out. Copy and pasting what I'm going to talk about probably won't work because everyone works in a unique context. You've got different people, you've got different stakeholders. Some challenges might be similar, but a lot of the challenges might be different. So the thing that I always try and advise in this situation is if you try and understand the things that I talk about, and then you apply to your unique context, then you'll be much better positioned for success. We've got a pattern here, not one size fits all. And if you don't like what I talk about tonight, and if it doesn't rock your boat, that's fine as well. Don't worry. Have a listen, be curious. Hopefully you take something from it. That would be a really good outcome. First up then, why change? So I think, and I suggest that this is a really good question to ask to guide us in any type of change that we do. And think about the pattern here. Start with why. So in this particular example, we had a new CEO with bold ambitions. It was a really challenging environment. Like for so many organizations now, dealing with cost pressures that were becoming ever more real. There were real constraints to handle, meaning investments, working harder and returning more. And you might be sat there thinking, that sounds similar to my context. You might be working for an organization with similar type of cost pressures upon them and bold ambitions of leadership. And it's not a surprise because there's a lot of that happening out there at the moment. And what I see, and you may see similar things, when you go on LinkedIn and you hear about the impact on people, employees working at some of these organizations. A lot of these organizations are responding by focusing on cost savings. But I think there could be another way, which is to deliver more value. So rather than cutting costs, how can we use what we have to get to more of that value? A little bit further context for this particular example. So this organization had a multi-year investment that had grown by about 50% since an initial transformation in 2014. But the operating model had largely stayed, it's not kept pace, let's say, with the investment and the challenges that changed. And those aspirations that they had went well beyond the current operating model. And the risk there was that they were potentially leaving millions in opportunity on the table. So the primary objective was to get to better value, but not at the expense of well-managed expectations. And also being a great place to work. These were things that were really important. So get more value, but still maintain well-managed, and do so in a way that creates an environment where people think it's a great place to work. So I was set an exam question by our leaders, which was, there must be a better way to deliver. Can you help us to find it? And after a period of insight gathering, using some data, and pulling the thread on symptoms that we saw and seeing where they led, we identified a root problem. Some of those symptoms that we were seeing, so there were sources of dissatisfaction from leaders about the return on investment, lack of progress against our strategic goals, a lack of purpose for folks in the teams. And we were starting to see that play through in things like attrition. And there were other things that we were seeing as well, but these are some of the key symptoms that we were seeing. And we had some data that backed up those insights. So we were seeing long lead times. In some cases, I was working with teams where we were looking at over 100 days for value to be delivered. And you think about that in terms of value and of learning as well, and understanding more about the environments that we're operating in. There was an awful lot of dependencies in the system, and internal surveys used to capture enablement scores, enablement index and engagement scores. We were seeing low scores with relation to those things. And the root problem that we identified was that there was a strategic void that existed between top of house business strategy and what the teams were taking to strategize in their context and then actually go and execute upon. So to improve that current reality that the organization was facing in the context of the why that I talked about before, two key opportunities were presented. So we wanted to improve the alignment between strategy and execution, and we wanted to reorganize people and resources. The change that we looked at was really broad, because we're talking about something transformational here, and with it, significant cultural change, mindset shifts. So we needed to think about the wider system for this kind of change. And the way that we did this, in partnering with some of the leadership, was to approach the change in 3 key stages. So stage 1 was that we needed to think about changes at the top of house, so that strategic layer. And what we looked at there were OKRs to align strategy to what we then go and execute on. So John and folks from SSH actually partnered with us on that as well. So that was a really good partnership that helped with some of that thinking. We then looked at the second piece, which was around structure. And what I'm talking about here is in terms of organizing for value. So what we focused on were long-lived, outcome-focused teams of teams. We called these outcome teams, really original, I know. But it was a change to get people to think about what were we actually trying to get people to think in terms of the outcomes. And then the third stage of this broader change was the operational level. So in terms of better ways of working, and this is where the team effectiveness piece comes in. Before we embarked on that team effectiveness stage, stages 1 and 2 were implemented. So this took a while. So we're talking about 18 to 24 month journey here. This isn't something that happened overnight. And those stages 1 and 2 better enabled a couple of patterns. So that focus on outcomes and the organize for flow of both value and learning. I'm not going to go into huge detail on those first 2 stages because there's enough in those first couple of stages for separate talks. We're going to focus more so on the third piece. So thinking about this journey of change, having implemented the first 2 parts of that wider change, the stage was now set for better outcomes. Although nowhere near perfect, we had an improved alignment between strategy and execution, which is a big thumbs up. We had a more suitable org design, which was organized for value. Again, not perfect, but much better than where we were. And we had some better supporting processes and tools. But what about the part of the system that builds and creates the things that generate value and learning? So despite those improvements I just mentioned that we've made in the first couple of stages, sources of dissatisfaction still remained with regards to teams and the return on investment. And for context, the teams that we're talking about here on average were costing about £800,000 a year. So not short change, and long lead times and suboptimal outcomes were leading to that dissatisfaction that I mentioned. So a new exam question emerged. How can we improve our teams to get to more value? So I've got an analogy. People like analogies. So it doesn't matter how good the fuel going into the car is. If the car's not set up to perform well, then the outcome's going to be suboptimal. Maybe if the outcome that you're looking for is to win a race with your car, you put in a great fuel, but you're not set up in the right way, you're not going to achieve that outcome. So although the organisation had made some significant moves to improve the way it thought about and communicate strategy, how it was organised, without the operating rhythm being improved and the operating of the teams and how they were supported in the wider context of the operating of the organisation, then we wouldn't be able to achieve the outcomes that we desired. So we had an idea, and this idea was for team effectiveness. What was interesting when we went through this journey is what we're really talking about in this context is, what makes a good team? And working out what good is for a team sounds really simple, but actually it's actually quite difficult. There's an awful lot of opinions about team performance and success, but ultimately where we landed it was that we need to align around what matters in the context of the organisation and what it's trying to achieve. And this is why I said at the start, you've got to be cognizant of the unique situations. What are the motivators for change within your organisations? And as you start to think about improvement, think about it in that type of context, you'll get more traction with it. So as a bit of an activity in Slido, I'm going to open up another poll, and I'm interested in your perspectives of what would you measure to understand if a team is high performing. And just invite people to just take a moment or two. You can put in more than one. Feel free to just throw some ideas in. Seeing some good things coming through. Collaboration, autonomy, transparency, team happiness, team wellness, return on investment, outcomes met, creative climate, frequent value deliveries, value delivery, delivered outcomes, psychological safety, okay, nice. Flow efficiency, cycle times, deployment frequency, client feedback, motivation, measure value, few inputs, lots of outcomes, ownership. Brilliant. So this is fantastic. And we're seeing there's some themes that are coming through. But what I'd say is there's an awful lot of opinions in this space. So there are lots of different ways that we might think we can measure if a team is high performing. And this was true in the context of what we were trying to do in the example of the financial services organisation I worked with. So what mattered most to this particular organisation was maximising the value created with the available capacity, but doing so in a balanced and sustainable way. So we often talked about team productivity, but that was leading to the wrong expectations and behaviours. What we were seeing play through was busyness of people. We were seeing lots of work being done. Nobody can complain about the fact that, you know, people aren't working hard. But were we working on the right things? Were we getting to the things that mattered for the organisation? So the bold ambitions of the new CEO that I mentioned and the complex and adaptive environment that they were facing required a shift in focus. And that shift was away from productive, which was traditionally the way of looking at this, to effective teams. We wanted teams working smarter, not harder. And the belief that was that with this shift, it would accelerate the delivery of strategy whilst creating a culture where people could enjoy doing their best work, because they were the things, if you remember, that mattered to the organisation. So thank you for sharing on that slide, Opal. It can be easy to be that person who judges and criticises, but in my experience, that's a surefire way to piss people off and turn people off. You get some of those walls come up. I've experienced those enforced change programs and seen how often it can fail. So what I found is it can be much better to bring people on the journey and help them be part of it. So with this idea of inviting people to change over inflicting change, it doesn't mean that you can't have, you know, well thought out change, or you shouldn't have structure and leadership, because they are important enablers. You know, autonomy is great, but guardrails are really important as well to ensure that people are staying on track with the things that matter. The way that we started to think about this then was, you know, we wanted to enable teams to build self-awareness of the opportunities that they had to improve. And the way that we did that was by creating a simple but balanced suite of metrics. And then those teams could use them to self-assess themselves against. The metrics that we're talking about here, we didn't want them to be used as a scorecard. We wanted them to be used more as a way to create understanding so that teams and stakeholders generate awareness of the current reality and then can plan incremental improvements towards some aspirational targets. So the goals was to create an environment where we see individuals and teams start to demonstrate behaviours that result in continuous improvement to get to those strategic outcomes. We didn't make it all up. We leveraged some external theory. So Hackman, if people have come across the 5-factor model, that's something that we used and we looked at from a team effectiveness perspective, and it talks about, you know, supportive organisational context, the importance of expert coaching, and how that enables, you know, a good direction for team effectiveness, amongst other things. BVSSH, better value, sooner, safer, happier. We absolutely used, you know, the principles and the mindset behind the movement with regards to this. This was an important external piece of applied theory that we leveraged. And then if anyone's come across the work that the Liberators folks have done, so a group of professional Scrum trainers, I follow a chap, Barry Overeem, really good. If you'll follow any of his blogs. And I came across this when I was doing some research, and it's awesome, you know, it's something that the Liberators group did. And it's the theory of Scrum team effectiveness. It goes into quite a lot of detail. They studied, you know, I think it was a couple of thousand Scrum teams, and they looked at what was some of the enablers for team effectiveness. So standing on the shoulders of giants, if you will, you know, leveraging good resources rather than starting from scratch. And what we found was that this was really useful as well, because it made it a lot easier to get going, but also we had some credible resources to reference, and it helped us to get buy-in from stakeholders rather than us positioning this as something completely, new and from scratch. People are more likely to listen if what you're proposing has got a little bit of credibility and backup. So away from like how we got there and more to what we were actually doing then. So a framework to help focus on improving what matters. What we were talking about here is aligning people on a shared understanding. So we wanted to provide a vision for what a performing team looked like. As we saw from the Slido before, there's a lot of different opinions. We were facing that within the example that we had. We wanted to bring in a set of objective data if we could, because what we wanted to do was take the emotion out of things. Again, there were a lot of opinions about how would you measure, and then there were a lot of opinions about, well, what does good look like in terms of those measures? And what we were finding was, depending on the context, they could be quite different. An example I'll use here was, I was invited into the performance management cycle of this organisation to hear from some of the leaders talking about their direct reports. And it was enlightening because one example somebody shared and said, hey, this person's done a fantastic job as a delivery lead. They've really taken the team to high performing. And I was like, wow, fantastic. My ears pricked up because I was like, hey, I'm looking at a piece of work here. Tell me more. Tell me the story. So they were like, well, they joined the team and the team didn't really have any sprint goals and they were never really finishing stuff. The burn downs looked terrible and they didn't really do proper planning and all of that kind of stuff. So yeah, it's pretty demotivating environment and stakeholders were unhappy. I was like, oh, that sounds pretty nasty. So what happened then? And it was like, well, now they've got sprint goals. I was like, oh, right, cool. What else? And it's like, well, they do sprint planning every sprint. Like, okay. What else? And it was like, engagement started to get better. I was like, okay. And they were like, that's kind of it. And I was like, oh, right. That to me is not high performing. That's a team that's maybe starting to get it together. And there's no doubt whatsoever that particular delivery lead was doing a fantastic job in coming in and maybe getting them on the right pathway. But don't kid ourselves, that's not high performing. That's not what's going to help us meet our ambitious goals that the CEO set. So we needed to try and help people realize that what we're talking about here is maybe not what they think good looks like. So by providing that objective data, aligning people's understanding, setting an aspirational culture, we wanted to make ungrounded subjective opinions redundant. We wanted to create an environment where people were starting to think outside the box rather than making tweaks within the box, challenging the system, improving it to get to genuine, step change. And then just that piece as well about the, shifting mindset from productivity to effectiveness. We wanted to ensure quality of change and sustainability of approach. And the idea was that transparency of what good looks like, the shared understanding, and then the method to create self-awareness, that would enhance those opportunities for team autonomy in the right way within those guardrails. It'd enable better continuous improvement. It'd enable more effective management support because we could see what's going on. People could ask for the help or people could maybe lean in where they could see it was needed. And likewise for expert coaching, and all of those things being enablers for effective teams. So unlocking better value in a balanced and sustainable way. Effective teams do this. So we wanted to create something that then described the key attributes. And this was what we came up with. So we were striving for performing, but what's helpful is we want to know what it looks like, in order to help us move towards it. You may recognize this. Does anyone recognize this model? It's a little bit of a variation on it, but maybe the words in there.
Tuckman.
Yeah, spot on. Yeah, the Tuckman model. And it's well known. And in this particular organisation, it was really well established, but the teams were struggling to have an impact when using it. So rather than introduce a completely new concept in, we leveraged the Tuckman model to try and provide a simple framing around it for how they could use it a little bit better. Now, what you'll see is a bit of an adaptation in terms of what we've created here. And you'll see that on the left-hand side, going to the right-hand side, you're going through forming, storming, norming, performing. You'll notice that underneath that, you can see a triangle of support. And the idea is that there's more support required early on in the team maturity. And that kind of tails off as the team becomes more mature. It'll never go completely, but it starts to tail off. And we started to try and help people understand high level, what did each of those stages feel like? But we didn't want to measure each stage because we care about the journey that teams will take to get to performing. If we created measures for every stage, people would probably get too lost on, how do I make this tiny tweak here to move from forming to storming? That's not the message we wanted to go with. We wanted to more go with, we want you to be on the journey to performing. You will go through different stages of maturity for the team, but the important thing to us is the trends in the metrics informing if the teams are on the right track or if they need help, whether that's self-identified or whether it's leadership leaning in because of the transparency. The specific measures that we created for measuring what matters for team effectiveness related back to that why that I started with in the presentation. So time to value and learning, demonstrable business value delivered in 30 days or less. And you might be sat there thinking, well, 30 days, that doesn't sound very good. But remember the example I used? Some of these teams were looking at over 100 days. And when we talked to folks on this, they're like, well, no chance we can get to that. So we wanted it to be ambitious, but we helped them to understand, well, we can get to these things. They are achievable, but they are bold in your context. But we went and did things like agile safaris and shown them that maybe there is another way when you look at what some other organisations may be looking at. Sufficient quality, satisfying customer. It was difficult for a lot of the teams to have an end-out external customer measure. So we looked at what we could do from an internal perspective, and we had internal sponsor, NPS for that. And then we wanted to limit the changes that fix incidents to below a certain percentage. I didn't get the percentage back on that, but they'd evolved that piece. And the point there was we didn't want to increase the value throughput at the expense of quality. So what we wanted to avoid was, yes, lots of value going through the system, but well, we've seen the percentage of production deployments fixing incidents go up as well. We wanted to maintain a healthy balance because that's sustainable. And then building on top of that, operating with meaningful purpose, engagement scores, and then obsessing with effective change enablement scores. The journey, it's not as linear as that. What we expect is teams will go up, down, backwards, forwards, lots of different ways, but we provided some stage indicators for team self-assessment. So this was just not for anyone to assess the team on, but for the team to use to help assess themselves and maybe think about some of the things that were important. People are familiar with this. This is the improvement kata. What we wanted to try and bring people into was structured approach to continuous improvement. This is a really powerful way to think about that. And to demonstrate that, this was a team that, some real example. We want teams to compete with themselves and take an incremental approach. So again, mentioned earlier on, we didn't want a scorecard to compare teams against each other. We wanted the teams to compare themselves. Target. So what we wanted to do was grasp the direction. So what were the performing measures? So if you remember, lead time, less than 30 days, NPS, greater than 60, and engagement and enablement, greater than 70. What's the current reality? So for this particular team, at that point in time, lead time was 95 days. on average. NPS was 35, engagement was 37, enablement 42. So quite a way away. So that first step was about them understanding their current reality, where maybe before they were like, things are all right, we're working hard, we're doing loads of stories. Actually, when we started to bring this to it, it was like, oh, hang on a second. If that's kind of where we've got to try and move towards in order to achieve the aspirations of the organisation, we need to think about things in a different way. You're not going to make the leap overnight, so we encourage people to identify what's the next target condition. And in this case, lead time 70 days, NPS 40, engagement 40, enablement 45. It's moving in the right direction. And then what we wanted people to do was conduct experiments to increment their way towards that direction. And in this case, an example of the experiment was they wanted to reduce WIP of epics, so work in progress. And the idea was that that would have an impact on lead time. Little's law indicates that that's something that could help. Experiment with user story mapping, again, those slices and focusing on the value, that will help with lead time. Doing so, you can engage the sponsor earlier with stuff that you can see and touch and it's tangible rather than status updates. Get that engagement early and often so the NPS goes up. And then, recognizing behaviors that drive positive impact, an engagement play. We did a few things to help with this to make it matter. We encouraged shared objectives, and we wanted the experiments adding to people's backlogs so they could plan for capacity. And then we wanted those objectives made visible. Hey, Zach, were you going to ask a question? Oh, sorry, it looked like you come off mute. It's all right. So that was the framing that we provided teams. And that was the structure that we tried to help put around some of this because it was different for them. And we wanted them to feel like there was some kind of pattern that they could follow. So some of the insights that we got off the back of it, I've had conversations since. How are things going? Leadership will make it or break it. So the pattern here, leaders go first. It needs to be important. Make it a regular part of the conversation. The expectation's different. It's going to feel different for people. That's okay. It should feel different for people. But make sure that that expectation is held. We want leaders role modeling the behaviors that we want to see in others. And without that change, things are likely to struggle. So the recommendation that I'd always say in this type of change is, we need exec level sponsorship, really. We need proactive leadership. Not just saying this matters, but then not backing it up. Another insight of learning, achieve big through small. So the change curve, it's not a myth. There's going to be folks who relish the change, and there's going to be others that don't. What we found off this was, hey, you can invite everyone, but maybe we choose to invest in those that are choosing to engage. If we try and do it with everyone at the same time, maybe it's just going to be too hard. So some of that investment in focusing a little bit smaller, maybe create some beacon teams who can be the pioneers for the change and show what good could look like. And then maybe you've got your late majority and maybe the laggards who look and say, oh, that actually does look okay. I'm gonna join. And if you use the dreaded performance management, not all bad. Think about how you can weave team effectiveness into it. So rather than make it about who's got the most vocal leader and they get the promos, how do we relate it back to things that matter to the organisation? We found it was better to start than wait for perfect. If we wait for perfect, we may never start. So the measures that we started with, they might not be the perfect measures. The invitation there is if you find something better, improve it. The framework can change over time as well. Learn with feedback, so measuring for learning, again, is another pattern. When teams learn something, support them to enable change, especially in those early days. It might be different for teams. They've maybe not had such an opportunity to experiment. If it doesn't go the way that they thought it was going to go, don't talk about failure, talk about learning. Don't criticize, nurture. Try and build some momentum around it. And then elevate the behaviors that people are showing that are having a positive impact. So recognize those early signs of growth. Celebrate them. Because if you can start to show people what good looks like, more people will, exhibit it. If you've got people that embody the type of behaviors that you want, the new mindset, then elevate them. These are the folks that you want leading your change. And if there's leaders that aren't aligned, help them first, absolutely. Coach them, support them. But sometimes it's not for everybody. And what we've got to do is we've got to look at it and say, hey, the most humane thing to do is make sure that we align people with the environment that best suits what they want to do. And you can use things like this to show, hey, this is about continuous improvement. Do you want to be on that journey for us as well? And that was what I wanted to share. So that was the story. Hopefully, started with the why, talked about some of the challenges that the folks face, talked about that wider change, talked about team effectiveness as an example, again, not a blueprint, and talked about how we approach that, some of the insights that we started to see off the back of it. I invite any questions that folks have. You can check out the Slido if there's anyone's added anything to Slido, or if people want to just shout questions out, go for it.
Or alternatively, put them in the chat if you'd like to put them there.
Yeah, of course.
I have one. What point did you feel like what you were trying to put in place, what you were trying to achieve, had started to gain a momentum of its own? You'd sort of let go of the infant on the without the stabilizers, sort of thing.
I think there's probably a couple of points that are important. One is the initial getting the buy-in from the senior leadership that you need to help you to build that momentum in the first place. And for that, I had two really strong advocates that sat in that senior leadership team. So, head of engineering, head of product, both very much bought into it. And they were able to create some of the environment for me to influence others. So that's one bit that's important early on. And then the next bit, which I think you were more referring to, is, hey, when we started to work this with the teams, how did they then start to run off the back of it? And I think we didn't achieve, there was no flywheel. We didn't get to that point. And when I spoke to folks, they're not at that point just yet. What we did get, which is, I don't know whether it's a halfway point, was what I mentioned there as being those early adopters and the folks who relish the change. So some of those engineering leaders that were going, wow, this is a great frame for me to now start working with my folks on. I didn't really think I had permission to do that before, for whatever reason that might be. Likewise, for some of those Scrum coaches or Agile coaches in the teams, it gave them something tangible to link some of this stuff back. So I don't think we ever realised full momentum, but I think we realised enough momentum to start. And then the idea is it'll grow over time. I think they're about, what would it be? They're about 6 months into the journey. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing pockets, of those 70 teams, a proportion are doing it well and a proportion haven't yet got on the journey.
That's still early days then, really, isn't it? 6 months.
Absolutely, yeah. And, this, I can't reinforce this point enough. change is a long thing. You know, this type of change, it's so long at times to get going. And I think that achieve big through small sort of mindset can be an enabler for that, for showing what good looks like. Hey, Anne, you've got your hand up.
Oh, I have. Thank you. And I can see there's a question in the chat, so I'll try and be quick. But my question just leads on from what you were saying there about change taking quite some time, particularly where you've got lots of things going on and you're a large organisation perhaps. So my question kind of relates to systems thinking, which I have an interest in personally. And you've talked about sort of managing change with systems thinking, and to me that's a lot about effecting systemic change, so sort of big change in complex changing environments. But it's also very much has a focus on systematic change, which I think you've talked quite a lot about in this fabulous session today. So you've had a real focus on team effectiveness, but my question is, are you looking beyond that, and do you have aspirations to look at more sort of value stream and more sort of ecosystem effectiveness?
It's a really good question, and we deliberately focused in the naming around team effectiveness, because in order for the teams to be effective, the organisation needs to become effective. So what we wanted to do was, rather than it be a top-down, these are the things that we're going to do to improve, because that's what a lot of organisations will do. You know, this is the transformation agenda that we're going to come up with, and we will then do that. We felt that there was power, and it's yet to play out, but we felt that there was power in enabling the teams to have more of a voice, to say, no, these are the things that are actually slowing us down, and giving them the platform to create more transparency. Whether or not everyone always listens and inspects off the back of it, but the framing was there for that to happen. And it might lead to, value streams to think about. It might lead to, how do we improve the technical capabilities of the organisation, because that slows us down.
Yeah. Oh, sure. Oh, thank you. That's super helpful. And I think that plays to another thing, which is about looking what is systemically desirable, but at the same time understanding what is culturally feasible, and getting the teams involved at an early stage, having a say, and what they see as being relevant, and getting them to set their goals in an incremental way is super helpful. Really. Thank you. That's great.
No worries. Thanks, Anne. Questions we've got in the chat. Let's have a quick look through. So, did you have to make changes as to how teams were incentivized? Yes, in the sense of, I mentioned this organisation had performance management, which was culturally interwoven in their DNA. So it was something that was in that organisation's DNA. But what I observed was the conversations in there seemed to be suboptimal. It seemed to be that people were using quite subjective opinion. Hey, this has happened, it was really good. Yeah, but what do you mean by good? How do you measure good? And maybe somebody whose leaders has got a bit more weight in the room, has a little bit more influence on where that person ends up in a 9 box or whatever it might be. So by changing the language a little bit, we gave people a really nice thing. You write in your end of year appraisal, how have you added value this year? Well, we identified that, lead time to value was X days. And we ran some experiments through the year. And what we were able to do was we were able to improve our system by automating tests, or by upskilling the team, or by cross-skilling, by reducing WIP, whatever it may be. And what we were able to do was enable greater value through throughput, reduce time to value, improve engagement, get the sponsors a bit happier because they've met their goals. And all of a sudden it was like, wow, you've done a good job. Like I can see exactly what's going on there. So in that sense was what we did or what we tried to encourage. Does that answer the question, David?
Yes, thank you.
Great, thank you. We'll take Julie's one and then we'll have a quick chat with Joe. So was there much resistance? I'm in a hierarchical organisation. that has rewarded command and control behavior. So autonomy can be an alien concept. Okay. Yeah. Yes, there is always resistance with this thing. I used to have a lot more hair a good few years ago, and so you notice a bit grey around the sides there. So yes, there's definitely resistance to this type of thing, and the way to, or the tactic that I use for this, and to be honest with you, it's the most effective way that I've found to work, is work out who your allies are. Sorry, the dog's going down for 1 second. Lola. Sorry. Yeah, so work out who your allies are in the organisation and partner with them. So I partnered with the head of product, I partnered with the head of engineering, and I was able to use their influence to influence their peers, which then didn't remove the resistance, but what it did do was it actually lessened some of that resistance to change. The other part that helped was, hopefully it came through, it was a relatively simple proposal, and it was aligned to things that people already understood to a degree, things like the Tuckman model. We could have created something new for the teams, but we recognised that trying to create something simple was important in getting over some of that resistance, you know, things like relearning new concepts and all of that kind of stuff. So yeah, hopefully to answer your question, like, yes, there was resistance, but hopefully there's a couple of tactics there that might be useful to help. Hopefully that answered the question, Julie.
That does help, thank you. I was thinking along the same lines in terms of kind of gathering our allies, and I did write some notes about the Tuckman piece as well. Sometimes it's kind of making the obvious really obvious, isn't it? And weirdly, my dog called Lola was kicking off at exactly the same time.
Oh, so. Fantastic. There you go, there she is.
Who? Yeah, I've got an apricot one, yeah, anyway.
Awesome.
Thank you so much, Simon, that's really helpful.
No worries, Julie. Thanks for the question. Jo, you've got your hand up.
Yes, thank you. Awesome presentation. My question would be around how much have you seen in terms of sharing teams who were going through this journey with other teams, and what was the form of sharing if it was happening?
Yeah, great question. So yes, so internal community of practice to amplify learnings. So we encouraged people to experiment. We encourage people to make those experiments visible, and then we encourage people to play back some of the things that they were actually seeing. So yeah, internal community of practice was an awesome thing for that. And the other thing, some of the leaders that nodded and agreed and said, yes, I'll help lead this through, didn't, and that will happen. But the community of practice was another vehicle to help keep it as something that mattered and was important. Some of the leaders were amazing and really stepped up and helped to lead the change through, and that was fantastic. That's what's needed. But in the absence of some of that, communities of practice can play a really important role. And the other tip, a bit of a ninja move with the communities of practice, have a look at who your sponsors are for your community of practice as well. If you can get the right folks sponsoring that can create a little bit of a movement in there as well. Thank you for the question. Rio, how did you go about increasing the engagement on the team, and how did you measure it? So the simple explanation for this one is the measurement. We used an internal survey. So it was an all associate survey, and it was based on a number of different questions, and then it came up with an index score. So what we wanted to do was, because that was the data point that allowed us access to all of the associates in the organisation, we wanted to leverage that. So that was how we measured it. In terms of how we went about increasing the engagement, it was more about how did the teams go about increasing the engagement. Because what we wanted the teams to do was say, hey, this is where our engagement scores are. Why is that? Let's reflect on it. Why are the engagement scores where they are? And if we wanted to move more towards the aspirational targets of performing, what would that look like in terms of some of the better ways of working, possibly? So we wanted to put the power in the hands of the folks in the teams to own their own continuous improvement, but not foregoing the role of leaders. Because as I was talking, when Anne asked that question, some of this was systemic. So if the teams wanted more autonomy, how did we do that? Did we remove dependencies and things like that? That's maybe a structural thing that leaders need to help with. But the idea was that through the self-assessment and teams having the opportunity to make these things visible, more transparency enabled better inspection to improve things. Hopefully that answers the question, Ario. We'll go to Oslo. How to measure metrics like enablement and engagement and enablement. Similar point. So we had an internal survey for that. Whether or not your organisations have that, and whether or not it's the best measure, it might be that there are other ways to measure that, and that's fine. Again, this is just an example, not a blueprint. So what I'd say is have a little look around. How could you do it within your context? There are lots of things out there as well. You can search online. I know there's things like team health type measures as well that I know some teams adopt, the pull checks and things like that. I think that's it from a questions in the chat perspective.
Yeah, and we've just gone past the bottom of the hour, so that's the hour. That was a super conversation, super presentation, Simon. Thanks so much for sharing your insight and your experience. And with you only being sort of 6 months or so into that, it's you know, that it does beg the request from us at some point. Could you come back and share with us how you've gotten on in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I'm super passionate about this stuff as well. So my invitation would be, if you've got more questions and you want to chat through some of this stuff, like absolutely feel free to to give me a shout. I'll just pop my contact details up there as well, so you can drop me an email, simon.noone@acceleratedoutcomes.co.uk, and you can find me on LinkedIn. I do a bit of posting and blogging as well. So yeah, by all means, connect on there, send me any questions, and yeah, hopefully that was useful. And yeah, I'd love to come back and chat again at some point in the future.
Superb, lovely. Thank you so much. Applause all round, and thank you also to everyone for turning up to our post-summer new term meetup. And we will be announcing, I think probably shortly in the next couple of weeks, we've got a couple of options for our October meetup, so we're rolling the dice on those, and we'd love to see you come back. So I'll be posting up this video very soon on our YouTube channel. Please go to that and subscribe, and we'll see you all soon. Thank you very much.
Cheers all.
Thank you.
Thank you.